The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels hummed beneath Elizabeth Evans' feet as she stepped onto the Amtrak platform, clutching her sleeping son close to her chest. A warm gust of wind swept through the station, rustling the loose strands of hair that had escaped from her ponytail. She adjusted Jackson's weight in her arms, ignoring the dull ache in her back. She had no room for exhaustion. Not when this trip was the only thing standing between her and the future she had been desperately fighting for. A second chance, a fresh start, a job that could finally turn things around. She inhaled deeply, pushing down the nervous energy buzzing in her chest. The train was packed, voices echoing off the steel beams above. Business travelers, students, families, and first-class elites moved in their own bubbles, some glancing at her, others passing by without a second look. Elizabeth had grown used to it, the unspoken judgment, the way people's eyes lingered on the young mother carrying a baby alone, their minds jumping to their own conclusions. The attendant checked her ticket and gestured toward the economy section. She nodded politely and made her way down the narrow aisle, careful not to jostle Jackson. The air inside the train was cool, almost sterile, a stark contrast to the summer heat outside. As she reached her seat, she caught sight of a man settling into the first-class section a few rows ahead. He moved with effortless precision, his charcoal grey suit immaculate, his posture straight, controlled. Daniel Whitmore. Even from this distance she recognized him. The kind of man whose name carried weight in medical journals and charity galas alike. He didn't notice her. He never did. She had seen his face on magazine covers, read about his brilliance, his medical breakthroughs, the lives he had saved, but beyond all that, there was something in his eyes, something distant, untouchable, as if he carried a burden no one else could see. Jackson stirred against her chest, and she gently rocked him, whispering, "Shh, baby, we're almost there." She sat down, securing Jackson's blanket before allowing herself to exhale. Her fingers brushed against the folded job interview invitation in her pocket. This was her shot, her only shot, to secure a position at Whitmore Publishing in New York. If she nailed this interview, she could finally stop living paycheck to paycheck. Finally give Jackson the life he deserved. But as the train jolted forward, a wave of uncertainty settled in. Would she make it in time? Would she be good enough? A soft murmur broke through her thoughts. I hope he doesn't cry the entire trip. Elizabeth's head snapped up. Across the aisle, a woman in designer heels and a tailored cream-colored suit was adjusting the bracelet on her wrist, her voice smooth but sharp. Jade Langford. The name was as polished as the woman herself. Elizabeth swallowed the sting in her throat. She had encountered people like Jade before. People who assumed that struggling mothers like her were inconveniences rather than human beings. Jade barely spared her a glance before returning her attention to her tablet. Elizabeth bit her tongue, turning away. This wasn't the time to get defensive. She leaned down and kissed Jackson's forehead, feeling the soft warmth of his skin. For now he was asleep, his little chest rising and falling steadily. That was all that mattered. Minutes passed. The train moved in a steady rhythm, the outside world blurring past the window. Elizabeth tried to relax, but a creeping unease settled in. It wasn't just the looming interview. It wasn't just Jade's judgmental gaze. It was something else, a sense that this trip would change everything. In first class, Daniel Whitmore leaned back in his seat, staring absently at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. His assistant had scheduled this trip months ago, a break from his relentless work, a moment to breathe between hospital rotations. But he wasn't sure he remembered how to stop. His fingers tapped restlessly against his knee. He should be reviewing patient files, catching up on research, anything other than sitting here, trapped in his own thoughts, and yet he felt the weight of them pressing down, suffocating. A child's cry broke the silence. His jaw tightened, his gaze flickering toward the sound. A few rows back, a woman was bouncing a baby in her arms, whispering soothing words. He recognized the look in her eyes. Exhaustion, determination, the kind of love that overpowered everything else. For a moment something inside him twisted, a memory, a pain he thought he had locked away. He turned away before it could surface. Elizabeth felt the shift in the train's movement, a gentle rocking that made her own eyelids heavy. She let her head rest against the window. Jackson tucked safely in her arms. She didn't know that within a few hours, everything would change. That Jackson's soft breathing would turn into ragged gasps. That the man in first class, the one who had spent years building walls around his heart, would be the only one who could save him. And that this train ride, this moment, was the beginning of something neither of them could have ever expected. The rhythmic hum of the train was almost soothing. Almost. Elizabeth adjusted Jackson in her arms, cradling him close as she leaned her head against the window. The vibration of the moving train, the dimmed lights of the cabin, the soft murmurs of passengers settling into their seats, it all should have made her feel at ease. But a restlessness tugged at her, keeping her wide awake. Jackson stirred slightly, his tiny fingers curling against the fabric of her sweater. His breathing was even, steady, but Elizabeth still felt the habit of worry creeping in. She brushed her lips against his forehead, warm, but not feverish. Yet she shook the thought away and let out a slow breath. She had to stop spiraling. She had too much riding on this trip to let anxiety pull her under. A few rows ahead, she caught a glimpse of Daniel Whitmore. He sat with perfect posture, a picture of effortless composure, his gaze fixed on something unseen beyond the window. He had barely moved since they departed. The untouched cup of coffee on his tray an indication that he was lost in his own world. She wondered briefly what kind of thoughts occupied the mind of a man like him, a man whose name carried weight in the medical field, whose career had undoubtedly been built on control, precision, and certainty. She bet he never had to worry about missing rent, or finding someone to watch his child while working a double shift, or hoping, desperately, that a single job interview could change everything. Her stomach twisted. It wasn't envy, not really. It was something else, a reminder of the distance between the life she had and the life she wanted. A sharp, annoyed sigh came from her right. Jade Langford. Elizabeth tensed but refused to turn her head. She didn't need to engage with whatever passive-aggressive comment the woman was brewing. She had met plenty of people like her, always polished, always poised, always looking at people like Elizabeth as though they were an inconvenience. It didn't take long before the first jab landed. "Is he going to cry the entire trip?" Jade muttered, not bothering to lower her voice. Elizabeth's grip on Jackson tightened. "He's asleep," she answered calmly, her voice even. "For now," Jade replied, flipping the page of the glossy magazine in her lap. "These trains are too cramped as it is." Elizabeth bit the inside of her cheek. She wanted to snap back, wanted to tell this woman exactly what she thought of her spoiled entitlement. But she knew better. She had learned over the years to pick her battles, so she didn't say anything. Instead, she shifted Jackson slightly, rocking him gently as her pulse slowed. But she wasn't the only one who had heard Jade's comment. "You don't have to announce every thought that crosses your mind," a voice said. Elizabeth blinked. Daniel Whitmore. His voice was smooth, controlled, yet there was an unmistakable edge to it. Jade turned her head, clearly surprised. "Excuse me?" Daniel didn't spare her a glance. "If the sound of a baby is unbearable, maybe consider noise-cancelling headphones." Elizabeth nearly choked on air. Jade's mouth parted slightly, caught between indignation and disbelief. "I wasn't—" Daniel finally looked at her then, one brow arching slightly in a way that made it clear he wasn't in the mood to entertain her complaints. "You were," Jade huffed, turning back to her magazine, but the tension in her posture betrayed her irritation. Elizabeth, still stunned, found herself watching Daniel, but his focus had already shifted back to his own thoughts, as if the exchange had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. Still, her chest felt unexpectedly lighter. She had spent so much of her life standing up for herself. It was strange to have someone else do it. The train gave a small lurch as it turned slightly along the tracks. The night sky outside stretched infinitely, dark and endless. Elizabeth sighed, shifting in her seat. She let her fingers graze over the folded paper in her pocket, the confirmation email for her interview. It was real. It was happening. But the what-ifs lingered. What if she wasn't good enough? What if they took one look at her resume, at the gap in her employment history, and dismissed her before she even had a chance? She tightened her grip on Jackson. She was doing this for him. She had to believe it would be enough. A soft murmur pulled her from her thoughts. Elizabeth, right? She looked up, surprised to find Maggie Thompson watching her with kind, knowing eyes. Yes, she said. Maggie smiled. I thought so. I overheard you saying your name to the attendant earlier. Elizabeth offered a small smile, already grateful for the woman's warm presence. I don't mean to pry, dear, Maggie continued gently, but I can see it in your face. You're carrying a lot on your shoulders. Elizabeth let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. That obvious? Maggie's expression softened. I raised 4 kids. I know the look of a mother who's running on empty. Elizabeth swallowed, something raw settling in her chest. She didn't know why, but the words hit deeper than she expected. Maggie reached into her bag and pulled out a small thermos. Tea? She offered. Elizabeth hesitated, but then nodded. Thank you. As she took the warm cup in her hands, something about the moment made her feel seen, not judged, not pitied, just understood. The train continued forward, carrying them through the darkness. Elizabeth didn't know what was coming next. She didn't know that within hours Jackson's soft breaths would turn uneven, that fear would take hold of her in ways she had never known, and that Daniel Whitmore, the man who had spent years avoiding his own past, would soon become the only person standing between her son and the unthinkable. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks created a steady, almost hypnotic hum. Outside the window, the night stretched endlessly, dark and still, interrupted only by the occasional flicker of distant lights from passing towns. Inside the train, a hush had settled over the cabin. Most passengers lost in their own worlds, reading, sleeping, scrolling through their phones. Elizabeth shifted slightly, careful not to jostle Jackson, who was still asleep against her chest. His tiny fingers curled around the fabric of her sweater, his breath warm against her skin, the weight of him in her arms, the rise and fall of his little chest should have been enough to calm her. But something wasn't sitting right. She had noticed it earlier, just a slight flush to his cheeks, a small restlessness in his sleep. Nothing alarming, not yet, but still, a mother knew. A sharp intake of breath broke her thoughts. Maggie, who had been quietly sipping her tea beside her, was watching her with an expression that made Elizabeth's stomach tighten. You're worried, Maggie said softly. Elizabeth let out a slow breath, nodding. I think he's a little warm. Maggie set her cup down and leaned in slightly, peering at Jackson's face. Have you checked his temperature? Elizabeth hesitated, brushing a hand over Jackson's forehead. He was warm, not burning up, but warmer than she would have liked. I don't have a thermometer, she admitted, her voice quieter than before. Maggie gave a small nod, her gaze thoughtful. He might just be overheated from being snuggled up so close, she offered. But... She hesitated. But? Maggie sighed. There's something in his breathing. Elizabeth's entire body stiffened. I don't want to alarm you, Maggie added quickly, but I've worked in pediatrics for a long time, and I know when something's off. It could be nothing, but it might be worth keeping an eye on. Elizabeth swallowed hard. The tightness in her chest grew stronger, creeping up her throat. Jackson stirred then, letting out a small whimper before settling again. The sound was tiny, barely noticeable, but it sent a bolt of fear through her. He's okay, she whispered, as much to herself as to Maggie. "He has to be." Maggie offered a kind smile, though there was something knowing behind it. Before Elizabeth could say anything else, movement in the first-class section caught her eye. Daniel Whitmore had stood from his seat, stretching slightly before making his way toward the cafe car. He moved with the same effortless control she had noticed earlier, his expression unreadable, his posture perfectly composed. He hadn't looked at her since his brief defense against Jade. Elizabeth exhaled, shaking her head at herself. Why did she even care? The train rocked slightly as it curved along the tracks. A soft overhead chime signaled that they had another 3 hours before their next stop. Maggie let out a sigh, reaching into her bag. "Here," she said, handing Elizabeth a small packet. Elizabeth looked down. A cooling gel strip. "For his forehead," Maggie explained. "It's not much, but it might help." Elizabeth blinked, surprised by the kindness. "Thank you." Maggie waved a hand. "Mothers help mothers. That's how it should be." Something in Elizabeth's chest ached at that. She had done so much of this alone for so long. Having someone, anyone, offer support, no matter how small, felt foreign. She carefully placed the strip against Jackson's forehead, feeling the coolness seep into his warm skin. He didn't stir. For a moment relief trickled in, and then a cough. Not from her, not from Maggie, from Jackson. A deep raspy sound that made Elizabeth's breath catch. She froze, waiting, listening. Another cough. Maggie's expression shifted. Elizabeth tightened her grip on Jackson, her heart hammering against her ribs. She needed to stay calm. She needed to think. The train gave a sudden jolt, and in that exact moment, Jackson whimpered, his tiny body curling in slightly against her. His breathing hitched. Elizabeth sucked in a breath. "Number no. Maggie leaned in closer. "Elizabeth, I know," she whispered. Panic clawed at her, but she forced it down. Jackson was still breathing. He was okay. She just needed to keep him comfortable. Another cough. Maggie's lips pressed together. Elizabeth clenched her jaw, willing herself not to cry, not to break down. She couldn't afford to. And then, as if fate had a cruel sense of timing, a deep voice cut through the air behind her. "What's wrong?" Elizabeth turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. Daniel Whitmore stood there, hands in his pockets, his gaze locked onto Jackson. His face was unreadable, but there was something behind his eyes now, something sharp, assessing. Elizabeth swallowed hard. "He's just a little warm," she said, keeping her voice steady. Daniel didn't move, but something about his presence felt heavier now. Maggie cleared her throat. "Doctor? Whitmore, do you have a moment?" Daniel's gaze flicked to Maggie, and for the first time, his carefully neutral expression cracked just slightly. "You know who I am?" Maggie offered a small, wry smile. "You don't work in medicine as long as I have without recognizing the names of the best in the field." Elizabeth's heart pounded. Daniel hesitated. Then finally, he let out a slow breath. "I don't practice anymore." Maggie tilted her head. "That doesn't mean you've forgotten how." Silence. The train rattled slightly, the overhead lights flickering for half a second. Daniel's gaze dropped back to Jackson. Another cough. Something shifted in his face. Elizabeth saw it. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his jaw clenched. A war, something he didn't want to feel, and yet he sat down, not in his seat, not somewhere distant, right next to her. Elizabeth barely had time to react before Daniel reached out, his fingers ghosting over Jackson's tiny wrist, his head tilting slightly as he listened to the soft, uneven breaths. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was assessing. And for the first time since she had stepped onto this train, Elizabeth felt something foreign. Hope. The train rocked gently as it sped through the darkness, the rhythmic hum of the wheels against the tracks filling the silence between them. Elizabeth barely breathed as she watched Daniel's fingers press lightly against Jackson's tiny wrist. His face was unreadable, his expression controlled, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. She wasn't sure what scared her more, what he might say, or what he wouldn't. Jackson shifted in her arms, letting out a soft, wheezy breath. The sound sent a fresh wave of panic crashing over her. Daniel exhaled slowly and glanced up. "How long has he been warm?" Elizabeth swallowed. "A few hours, maybe since we got on the train. I thought it was just from me holding him. But now—" Her voice wavered. "Now I don't know." Daniel gave a small nod, but he didn't look away from Jackson. His focus was sharp, deliberate. He was already piecing things together in his head. Maggie leaned in slightly. "His breathing sounds tighter than before." "I know," Daniel murmured. He reached for Jackson's tiny hand, gently pressing a fingertip against the soft skin before turning his wrist ever so slightly. His movements were effortless, practiced. Even as Elizabeth's heart pounded, she couldn't help but notice the way his touch was careful, delicate, despite the control in his posture. She had read about him before. The articles, the interviews, people called him brilliant, a mind that worked faster than most, a natural at his craft. But seeing him like this, seeing him so close, was something else entirely. Daniel finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers. "Has he been around anyone sick recently?" "No," she answered quickly. "I mean, I don't think so. I work at a diner, so maybe, but no one's mentioned anything. He was fine this morning." Daniel nodded again, but Elizabeth saw something shift in his expression, a small crack in his composure. "What?" she pressed. Daniel hesitated. Maggie frowned. "Daniel." He exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "His breathing isn't where I want it to be," he admitted. "It could be a respiratory infection." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. "But it could also be something mild," Daniel added quickly, likely noticing the way her entire body tensed. "I don't want to make assumptions without seeing how he progresses." Jackson let out another soft whimper, burying his face into Elizabeth's sweater. His tiny body curled into hers, as if he knew something was wrong. Her heart clenched. "What do I do?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Daniel sat back slightly, his fingers tapping once against his knee. "For now, keep him upright as much as possible. Watch for any retractions in his breathing." "Retractions?" "If his chest starts pulling in too deeply with each breath," Daniel explained, his voice steady, "it means he's working too hard to get air." Elizabeth's fingers curled around Jackson's back, her body already tense at the thought. "I have a humidifier in my bag," Maggie said, already reaching down. "It's small, but if we can get a little steam near him, it might help." Daniel nodded. "That'll be good." The train gave a sudden lurch, throwing them all slightly forward. Jackson let out a small cry, and Elizabeth's heart clenched. The overhead speaker crackled to life. "Attention passengers! We apologize for the turbulence. We are currently entering a storm system, and the ride may be a little rough for the next hour. We appreciate your patience." A storm. Of course. Elizabeth closed her eyes for half a second. Because why wouldn't there be a storm? Why wouldn't the one time she needed everything to go smoothly, life decided to do the exact opposite? She forced herself to take a breath. This wasn't the time to panic. Daniel glanced toward the window, his expression unreadable. "That's not ideal." "You think?" Elizabeth muttered before she could stop herself. Daniel turned back to her, surprised at the sharpness in her voice. Elizabeth shook her head quickly. "I'm sorry, I didn't—" "It's fine," Daniel said, but something flickered across his face. "I know this isn't easy." Elizabeth looked down at Jackson, at his flushed cheeks, at the way his little chest moved just a little too fast. "No," she admitted quietly. "It's not." For a second, neither of them spoke, and then, "I can stay," Daniel said. Elizabeth blinked, looking back up at him. "What?" Daniel cleared his throat slightly. "If you want," he said, almost hesitant now, "I can sit with you for a while. Keep an eye on him." Elizabeth had no words. Daniel Whitmore, the same man who had spent the entire train ride avoiding eye contact with the world, the same man who had made it clear he didn't want to be involved in anything outside his own space. He was offering to stay. It wasn't pity in his voice. It wasn't obligation. It was something else. Something she couldn't quite place. Maggie gave her a knowing look. Elizabeth's lips parted, but she hesitated. She had done everything on her own for so long. She wasn't used to accepting help, wasn't used to someone stepping in. But Jackson let out another tiny cough, and in that moment, there was no room for pride. She nodded. Okay. Daniel gave a small nod in return. He didn't move back to his first-class seat. He didn't return to his untouched coffee. Instead, he stayed right where he was. And for the first time since boarding this train, Elizabeth didn't feel so alone. The train rattled against the tracks, the soft glow of overhead lights casting a dim haze over the cabin. Outside, rain streaked against the windows, the steady downpour blurring the world beyond. The storm had arrived in full force, thick clouds swallowing the sky, flashes of distant lightning illuminating the darkness for only a second before vanishing again. Elizabeth barely noticed any of it. Her entire world had shrunk down to the tiny weight in her arms. Jackson was still curled against her chest, his breathing shallow, his little body warm. Too warm. Every now and then he would shift slightly, letting out a small whimper, his tiny fingers clutching at the fabric of her sweater. Daniel sat beside her, silent, watching. She didn't know what unsettled her more, Jackson's condition or the fact that she was relying on a man she had never spoken to before tonight. A man who, hours ago, had been nothing more than a name she had seen in medical articles. Now he was the only thing tethering her to sanity. Maggie had excused herself for a moment, leaving the two of them alone. The air between them was heavy, filled with things neither of them were saying. Daniel was the first to break the silence. You need to get him seen as soon as we reach New York. Elizabeth let out a quiet breath. I know. He turned slightly, angling himself toward her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something softer in his voice when he spoke again. What hospital are you taking him to? Elizabeth hesitated. I don't know yet. She let out a slow breath, pressing her lips together. I was supposed to go straight to a job interview when we arrived. Daniel's brows pulled together slightly, like he hadn't expected that answer. What kind of job? Elizabeth swallowed. She wasn't sure why she suddenly felt self-conscious, but under Daniel's gaze, she felt like she was admitting something too personal. A publishing company, she said finally. It's an entry-level assistant position, but it's something. Daniel nodded, considering this. And this job, it's important. She gave a small, breathless laugh, though there was no humor in it. More than important. It's everything. Daniel studied her for a moment, then glanced down at Jackson. You're doing this alone, he said. Not a question, but a quiet statement of fact. Elizabeth stiffened slightly, her fingers tightening around Jackson. Yes. Daniel exhaled through his nose, leaning back slightly. His gaze lingered on Jackson's small form before flicking back up to her. You're strong. Elizabeth blinked. That was unexpected. People always had things to say about single mothers, words wrapped in pity, in judgment, in assumptions, but strong? No one had ever told her that before. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Then quietly, she admitted, I don't feel strong. Daniel's gaze held hers, unwavering. That doesn't mean you're not. Something about the way he said it made her chest ache. Before she could respond, Jackson stirred again. This time, his tiny body trembled with a soft cough, one that sent another bolt of fear through her. Daniel's entire posture changed. Immediately, he reached out, resting a hand lightly against Jackson's back, listening. His brows furrowed. His breathing is more labored than before. Elizabeth's heart pounded. She knew that. She had been listening to every breath, feeling the shift in the way his little chest moved. What do we do? She whispered. Daniel's jaw tightened, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. I have a small pulse oximeter in my bag, he said finally. It'll measure his oxygen levels. Elizabeth's breath caught. You have one with you? He nodded. I always carry certain medical supplies when I travel. It was the first time she had ever been grateful for how methodical and precise he seemed to be. Daniel stood, moving quickly but without panic, making his way toward first class. Elizabeth held Jackson closer, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She rocked gently, pressing a kiss to his soft curls. We're okay, she whispered. You're okay? But the fear in her chest was spreading. A few minutes later, Daniel returned, a small device in his hand. Without hesitation, he sat beside her again, motioning for Jackson's little hand. Elizabeth shifted him slightly, watching as Daniel carefully clipped the pulse oximeter to Jackson's tiny fingertip. The small screen flickered on, numbers appearing. Elizabeth didn't know what they meant, but Daniel did, and she saw the way his expression changed. Her stomach dropped. What? She demanded. What does it say? Daniel didn't answer immediately. His lips pressed together slightly, his mind working fast. Finally, he let out a slow breath. His oxygen levels are lower than I'd like. Elizabeth felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. Panic surged. How low? Daniel hesitated, then met her gaze. Not an emergency yet, but we need to be careful. Elizabeth's grip tightened around Jackson. The weight of the situation pressed down on her like a physical force. The storm outside, the delays, the hours before they would reach New York. It wasn't just a bad cold. It wasn't just something that would pass on its own. Jackson was struggling, and the only person standing between him and something worse was Daniel Whitmore. Elizabeth took a shaky breath. She didn't trust easily. She had learned the hard way that people left, that promises weren't always kept. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, she had no choice but to trust this man with the most precious thing in her world, her son's life. The steady hum of the train beneath them did nothing to quiet the rising panic in Elizabeth's chest. The numbers on the small screen of the pulse oximeter were still glowing, a silent warning, a confirmation of everything she had feared. Jackson's oxygen levels were dropping, not dangerously low, not yet, but enough that Daniel's expression had changed, enough that he was no longer just an observer. Elizabeth tightened her grip around her son, pressing him closer as if holding him tighter would somehow keep him safe. What do we do? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't answer right away. He exhaled, his fingers pressing lightly against Jackson's tiny wrist again, checking his pulse. His brow furrowed, his mind clearly working through the possibilities, weighing the risks. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but firm. We need to keep him stable until we get to New York. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. That's still hours away. Daniel's jaw tensed. I know. Jackson stirred slightly, letting out another soft, wheezy cough. Elizabeth felt the sound vibrate against her chest, and she forced herself to swallow the fear threatening to overtake her. Daniel reached for his bag, unzipping a small side pocket. I have an emergency inhaler, he said. It's not meant for someone his age, but in cases like this it can help open up the airways. Elizabeth's breath hitched. Is it safe? She asked quickly. Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze. It's not a long-term solution, but right now, yes. It's safer than letting his oxygen keep dropping. Elizabeth nodded, forcing herself to trust him. Daniel's movements were precise as he prepped the inhaler. He shifted slightly, positioning himself to hold the small mask gently over Jackson's tiny face. Just a few breaths, he murmured, his voice softer now. Come on, little guy. Breathe for me. Elizabeth held her breath as she watched. Jackson's little fingers twitched, his chest rising and falling in uneven patterns. Daniel counted under his breath, timing each inhale, each exhale, watching intently for any sign of improvement. Seconds stretched into eternity, and then Jackson's breath hitched. For a terrifying moment, Elizabeth thought it had gotten worse, but then his chest rose again. This time, just a little smoother, a little deeper. Daniel let out a slow breath. That's it, he murmured. That's what we needed. Elizabeth didn't realize how tightly she had been gripping her sweater until her hands began to shake. She pressed her lips to Jackson's forehead, her heart pounding. "You're okay, baby," she whispered. "You're okay." Daniel didn't say anything, but when she looked up, she caught something in his expression. Something unguarded, something she hadn't seen before. Concern, not the distant clinical concern of a doctor with a patient. Something more. The train jolted slightly as it hit another stretch of rough tracks, and a soft chime rang overhead, signaling an announcement. "Attention, passengers! Due to severe weather conditions, we will be making an unscheduled stop at Albany Station for an extended delay. We apologize for the inconvenience and will provide updates as they become available." Elizabeth's stomach sank. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no, this can't happen right now." She looked at Daniel in pure desperation. "How far is Albany from New York?" Daniel exhaled. "Still hours away." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "We have to get him to a hospital," she whispered, panic creeping in. "We can't wait. We can't." Daniel's hand closed over hers. Elizabeth stilled. His touch was firm, grounding, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "I won't let anything happen to him." She didn't know why, but she believed him. Jade Langford's voice cut through the tense moment. "Well, isn't this just wonderful?" Elizabeth turned, her frustration flaring. She had almost forgotten Jade was still in the cabin, but of course she was, and of course she was annoyed. Jade sighed dramatically, adjusting the expensive bracelet on her wrist. "I swear, trains are always unreliable. I have a meeting in the morning, and now I'm stuck in the middle of nowhere." Elizabeth barely bit back a sharp response, but Maggie, who had returned just in time, raised an eyebrow at Jade instead. "Oh yes," Maggie said dryly. "We're all very sorry for the inconvenience to your schedule." Daniel, to Elizabeth's surprise, spoke next. "Some things are more important than meetings," he said simply. Jade turned to him, her brows lifting slightly. "I suppose this is where you give me a lecture about compassion?" Daniel met her gaze. "Number, I just think it must be exhausting to always assume the world revolves around you." Jade's mouth parted slightly, but for once she had no immediate response. Elizabeth almost felt a small sense of satisfaction. Almost. But her attention immediately returned to Jackson, her fingers brushing his forehead again. Still warm, still breathing too fast, still not okay. Maggie placed a gentle hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. "We'll get through this," she said softly. Elizabeth wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe Daniel. She wanted to believe that everything was going to be okay. But as the train slowed, pulling into the storm-drenched Albany station, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The train screeched as it slowed into Albany Station, the heavy rain outside blurring the glow of station lights. The rhythmic hum that had filled the train for hours faded into an eerie stillness. A few passengers stirred, stretching, mumbling about the delay, but to Elizabeth, the entire world had narrowed down to the small fevered weight in her arms. Jackson let out another weak cough, his tiny body trembling against her. She tightened her hold on him, pressing her lips to his damp curls. His breathing was still too fast, still uneven. She needed to get him to a hospital. She needed to move. But the moment she looked up, her stomach twisted. Outside the train, the platform was soaked, rain pounding against the pavement in thick sheets. Wind howled through the station, rattling the metal awnings. Then came the announcement. "Attention, passengers! Due to extreme weather conditions, Albany Station will be temporarily closing exits for safety reasons. We ask that all passengers remain inside the train until further notice. We apologize for the inconvenience." A collective groan rippled through the cabin. Elizabeth barely heard it. She turned to Daniel, her voice thin, urgent. "They can't do that! Jackson! He needs help now!" Daniel's expression remained calm, but she saw the way his jaw tightened. He was thinking, calculating. He turned toward the aisle, flagging down the conductor who was making his way through the train. "Ben!" Daniel called. The conductor paused, looking over at him. "Doctor?" His gaze flickered to Elizabeth and Jackson, and some of the irritation on his face softened. "Everything okay?" "No," Daniel said bluntly. "The child needs medical attention. We need clearance to get off the train." Ben ran a hand through his damp hair. "Look, I get it, but the storm's serious. Flooding's already started in some areas, and EMTs are tied up with other emergencies. The station's locked down." Elizabeth felt her heart drop. She tightened her arms around Jackson, her pulse hammering. "Please," she whispered, "I'll go myself. I don't care about the storm. Her voice broke. "I just need to get him help." Ben sighed, glancing at Jackson again. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say yes, but then he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I can't let you off the train," he said, his voice heavy. "Not until we get the all clear." The words hit her like a physical blow. Jade, who had been watching from her seat, scoffed lightly. "I'm sorry, but this is ridiculous. This train is stranded because of a little weather." Ben shot her an unimpressed look. "Lady, it's more than a little weather. I've been working the rails for 20 years, and I've never seen a storm come in this fast." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low, determined. "If we can't leave, then I need access to a medical kit. There has to be one on board." Ben hesitated. "We have a basic first aid kit, but nothing for respiratory distress." Daniel exhaled slowly, weighing his options. Elizabeth could barely breathe. Jackson whimpered again, his tiny fingers clutching at her sweater. His body felt heavier now, like he was sinking deeper into exhaustion. "No, no, no," she shook her head. "We can't just sit here. We have to do something." Daniel looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. Then he turned back to Ben. "Take me to the first aid kit. I need to see what we're working with." Ben hesitated only for a second before nodding. "Come with me." Daniel shot Elizabeth one last glance, his voice steady. "I'll be right back." And then he was gone, disappearing into the next car, with Ben. Elizabeth rocked Jackson gently, pressing another kiss to his forehead. His skin was still too warm, his little breaths too fast. She fought back the panic, clawing at her chest. Maggie sat beside her, resting a gentle hand on her arm. "He's strong, sweetheart. He's fighting." Elizabeth swallowed the lump in her throat. Her voice wavered. "I don't know what I'll do if—" "Shh." Maggie squeezed her hand. "You're not alone in this." Elizabeth wanted to believe her. The minutes stretched on, dragging like hours. Rain continued to pelt against the windows, the train shaking slightly from the wind. The voices of other passengers became background noise, muffled, distant. Then finally, Daniel returned. Elizabeth sat up straighter as he approached, her pulse spiking. "What did you find?" Daniel lowered himself onto the seat beside her, setting down a small black medical bag. He opened it quickly, scanning the contents. "It's not much," he admitted. "Some basic supplies. No oxygen, no nebulizer." Elizabeth's stomach twisted. "Then what do we do?" Daniel exhaled. "I can manage his symptoms, but we need to keep him as stable as possible until help arrives." Elizabeth's hands shook as she adjusted Jackson in her arms. "He's getting worse, isn't he?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Then quietly he said, "I won't let it get to that point." There was something about the way he said it, so certain, so firm, that made Elizabeth's breath hitch. He wasn't just saying it to reassure her, he meant it. Jade let out a small sigh from across the aisle. "Well, since we're all stuck here, I suppose there's nothing to do but wait." Elizabeth shot her a sharp look, but before she could say anything, Daniel spoke first. "Waiting isn't an option," he said. Jade raised a brow. "And what, exactly, do you suggest?" Daniel didn't answer her. Instead, he turned back to Elizabeth. "I need you to trust me," he said softly. Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest. She had spent so long relying only on herself, so long believing she couldn't afford to lean on anyone else. But now, Now her son's life was in the hands of a man she barely knew, and she had no choice but to trust him. So she nodded. Okay. Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, then got to work. The storm raged on outside, the train trapped in the middle of it. But inside, in the dim glow of the cabin lights, Daniel Whitmore wasn't just a doctor anymore. He was Jackson's best chance, and Elizabeth's only hope. The storm outside raged on, rain hammering against the train windows, wind howling like a warning. The passengers murmured in frustration, complaining about the delay, about the storm, about things that didn't matter, not to Elizabeth, not when Jackson was still in her arms, warm and fragile, his tiny breaths uneven, each one a battle she couldn't fight for him. Daniel sat beside her, focused, determined, his hands moving quickly as he sorted through the limited medical supplies he had managed to get from the train's first aid kit. His presence was steady, controlled, but she could see it now. The tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tightened slightly when he glanced at Jackson. He wasn't just treating a sick child, he was fighting against time. Elizabeth swallowed hard. "Tell me what to do!" Daniel didn't look at her, his focus locked on Jackson. "Hold him upright," he instructed. "We need to keep his airway as open as possible." She adjusted her grip, cradling Jackson against her chest, feeling the soft rise and fall of his breathing. Still too fast. Daniel pulled out a small vial and syringe. "What is that?" Elizabeth asked, panic creeping in. "A bronchodilator," Daniel said calmly. "It'll help relax his airways. But we need to be careful with the dosage." Elizabeth's arms tightened instinctively around Jackson. She hated this. Hated that she had no choice but to trust someone else with her son's life. But what terrified her even more was the alternative, doing nothing. She nodded once. "Okay." Daniel exhaled, then carefully prepared the dose, his movements precise. "Elizabeth," his voice softened, "I need you to trust me." She met his gaze, and for the first time she saw something behind his steady exterior, something personal, something raw. This wasn't just another patient to him. This wasn't detached professionalism. This was different. She took a shaky breath. "I do." Daniel nodded, then gently administered the injection. Jackson whimpered softly, stirring in her arms. Elizabeth rocked him instinctively, whispering soothing words against his soft curls. "Shh, baby, I'm here. You're okay. Mummy's here." The tension in the air was suffocating. Every second stretched unbearably long. Elizabeth felt Daniel watching Jackson closely, counting under his breath, waiting for signs of improvement. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Jackson took a deeper breath. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. Just a little smoother. Daniel let out a slow breath. "That's a good sign," he murmured. Elizabeth sagged in relief, tears burning in her eyes. But then, from across the aisle, "Well, thank God for that." Jade's voice cut through the tension. "Now maybe we can all relax." Elizabeth's head snapped up, anger flashing in her chest. Relax? She was about to say something. Something sharp. Something that would finally let Jade know just how little she understood. But Daniel spoke first. "You can go back to ignoring everyone now," he said, his voice flat but edged with something firm. Jade scoffed. "I was just saying—" "No," Daniel cut in, his eyes cool as they met hers. "You weren't saying anything that mattered." Jade's lips parted slightly, as if no one had ever spoken to her that way before. She held his gaze for a moment, then huffed quietly and turned away. Elizabeth blinked. She had been prepared for another argument, another dismissive remark, but Daniel had ended it before it could even start. More than that, he had stepped in, again. Her chest tightened, something unfamiliar settling inside her. Maggie, who had been watching quietly from her seat, gave Elizabeth a knowing smile before standing. "I'm going to get us all some tea," she said, "unless, of course, our first-class friend would like to order us something a little fancier." Jade didn't respond. Maggie winked at Elizabeth, then made her way toward the cafe car. Elizabeth let out a quiet breath, looking down at Jackson. His breathing was still fast, but his tiny face looked a little less strained now. She turned back to Daniel. "How long will it last?" Daniel exhaled. "A few hours, hopefully, but he still needs to be seen as soon as we get to New York." Elizabeth nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll take him straight to the hospital." Daniel studied her for a second, then said, "I'll go with you." She blinked, caught off guard. "You don't have to." "I know," Daniel said simply, "but I'm going." Elizabeth didn't have words. This man, this stranger, had no reason to stay, no obligation, and yet he was choosing to. She felt something crack inside her, something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not just relief, not just gratitude, something else, something terrifying, something she didn't know how to name. She looked down at Jackson again, brushing her fingers through his soft curls. For the first time since boarding this train, she let out a breath that didn't feel like a weight pressing against her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this after all. The train remained motionless at the Albany station, rain continuing to lash against the windows in thick, relentless sheets. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, filled with tension and unspoken fears. The world outside was drenched in darkness, but inside Elizabeth's focus remained on the fragile warmth of Jackson's body against hers, on the shallow rhythm of his breath, on the way Daniel sat beside them, a steady presence in the storm. Jackson stirred slightly, his tiny fingers twitching against her sweater. She pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, hoping he could somehow feel the love, the silent prayers she poured into every touch. Daniel watched him closely, his expression unreadable, though Elizabeth could see the wheels turning in his mind, the relentless calculations of a man who had spent his life making life or death decisions. "How's his breathing?" Daniel asked softly. Elizabeth swallowed. "Still too fast." Daniel nodded, his gaze never leaving Jackson. "But his oxygen levels haven't dropped further, which is good." Good. The word felt like a fragile thread of hope, something Elizabeth clung to, even as fear still loomed over her. Maggie returned with 3 cups of tea, her steps careful as she handed Elizabeth one. "It's chamomile," she said gently. "Won't fix everything, but it'll keep you warm." Elizabeth accepted it with a grateful nod, though she barely tasted the first sip. "Thank you." Maggie settled into her seat, her sharp eyes flicking between Elizabeth and Daniel. "You know," she mused, stirring her own tea, "I've been watching the two of you. It's funny." Daniel arched an eyebrow. "Funny how?" Maggie smirked. "How a few hours ago you were practically strangers, and now, well," she shrugged, "you look like a team." Elizabeth blinked, caught off guard by the statement. A team? She had never had one before. Her entire life, it had been just her and Jackson. She had done it all, every late-night feeding, every fever scare, every moment of exhaustion, doubt and fear, alone. But now, in this impossible moment, on this unmoving train, in the middle of a storm, she wasn't alone. She had Daniel, for now at least. Daniel didn't react to Maggie's words, but Elizabeth saw the way his fingers tapped against his knee, a small, restless movement. Maggie continued, oblivious to, or maybe fully aware of, the tension her words had stirred. "It's a rare thing, you know, finding someone who stays." Elizabeth's breath hitched slightly. She didn't know if Maggie had meant it the way it landed, if she knew the weight of those words. Daniel, however, looked away, his jaw tightening for half a second before he spoke. "People don't always stay." His voice was quiet, almost distant. Maggie studied him for a long moment before nodding. "No, they don't." Elizabeth felt something shift in the air between them. For a moment she saw something in Daniel's expression, a flicker of something buried deep, something old and unresolved. He wasn't just talking about people in general, he was talking about someone specific. Jackson whimpered again, breaking the silence. Elizabeth immediately rocked him, whispering soothing words. Daniel snapped back to focus, his hand moving instinctively to check Jackson's pulse again, his brows furrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything. Elizabeth didn't need him to. She could see it in his face. He was still worried. Her grip tightened around Jackson as she met Daniel's gaze. "Be honest with me," she whispered. "How bad is this?" Daniel hesitated just for a second. Then, with quiet honesty, he said, "We're not out of the woods yet." Elizabeth swallowed hard, nodding. Jade, who had been uncharacteristically silent until now, suddenly sighed dramatically. "You know, not that anyone asked, but I still don't understand why you didn't fly to New York." Elizabeth turned to her slowly, exhaustion and frustration simmering beneath the surface. Jade continued, oblivious or uncaring of the tension. "I mean, if this job was so important, why not take a flight? You would have been there by now instead of, well, this." She gestured vaguely around the train. Elizabeth stared at her for a long moment, torn between anger and disbelief. Then finally, she let out a quiet, breathless laugh. Jade blinked. "What's so funny?" Elizabeth shook her head. "You have no idea what it's like, do you?" Jade frowned. "Excuse me?" Elizabeth met her gaze, exhaustion stripping away any filter she might have had. "You've never had to check your bank account before buying groceries, have you? Never had to choose between paying rent and keeping the lights on? Never had to wonder if you could afford a plane ticket while also making sure there was food on the table?" Jade's lips parted slightly, but Elizabeth kept going. "I couldn't fly because I couldn't afford it," she said simply. "I had just enough money for this train, for this one chance at a better job, a better life for my son. And now I don't even know if I'll make it in time." Silence. Jade didn't speak. For the first time, she didn't have a single smug comment. Elizabeth turned back to Jackson, rocking him gently, her heart aching. Daniel beside her was quiet. But when she glanced at him, she saw something in his expression she hadn't expected, something that looked a lot like admiration. Maggie finally broke the silence, her voice soft. "You're a good mother, Elizabeth." Elizabeth let out a slow, shaky breath. "I don't always feel like one." Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. "That's how I know you are." She looked at him, something in her chest tightening. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, in the dim glow of the train cabin, something else was brewing. Something unspoken, something that felt a lot like the beginning of something neither of them had expected. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. Rain pounded against the train windows, lightning flashing intermittently, momentarily illuminating the station platform before darkness swallowed it again. The air inside the cabin was thick with unease, the weight of the delay pressing down on everyone. But for Elizabeth, time had already unraveled. Jackson's breathing had steadied slightly, but it was still too fast, still labored. He felt heavier in her arms, his tiny body too warm, his skin flushed. She rocked him gently, whispering soft reassurances even as her own fear clawed at her throat. Daniel was watching him carefully, his jaw set, his mind working through scenarios. Elizabeth had seen doctors before. She had seen the hurried glances, the practiced sympathy, the way they rushed through explanations with cold efficiency before moving on to the next patient. But Daniel was different. He wasn't just checking Jackson's vitals. He was studying every detail, every change in his expression, every flutter of his little eyelids. It felt like he cared, and that scared her more than anything. She adjusted Jackson slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me the truth." Daniel's gaze flickered to her. "I already did." "No," she murmured, shaking her head. "Not the doctor's version. The real version. The one you don't say out loud." Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes locked on hers. Then after a long pause he spoke. "If his oxygen levels drop again, we don't have many options left." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. "The medication helped, but it's temporary," Daniel continued, his voice quiet, measured. "If we were in a hospital, I'd have him on a nebulizer, maybe even oxygen support, but here..." He trailed off, shaking his head. We need to keep him stable until we can get help. That's all we can do. Elizabeth felt a sharp sting behind her eyes, but she forced herself to stay steady. She didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Not now. Daniel hesitated before adding, I know that's not what you wanted to hear. She let out a breath, a hollow laugh escaping her lips. I stopped getting what I wanted a long time ago. Daniel's gaze softened. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. Another cough rattled from Jackson's tiny chest, and Elizabeth instinctively held him closer. Maggie returned just in time, placing a warm hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. I asked the conductor for an update, she said gently. Still no word on when we're leaving. Elizabeth nodded numbly. Jade, who had been unusually quiet, finally let out a sigh, shifting in her seat. This whole thing is ridiculous, she muttered. You'd think with all the money they charge for first class, they'd have a backup plan for things like this. Elizabeth turned slowly, exhaustion dulling the sharp edge of her patience. Some things, she said quietly, you can't buy your way out of. Jade's mouth parted slightly, as if the thought had never occurred to her. For once, she didn't have a comeback. Instead, she shifted uncomfortably, looking away. The silence stretched on. Elizabeth pressed her lips against Jackson's forehead, his soft curls damp with sweat. Her heartbeat felt too loud, her breathing too shallow. Then the train jolted, not moving. Something else. Daniel's head snapped up. What was that? A second later, the lights flickered. The entire train groaned as if something had shifted deep within its structure. Maggie tightened her grip on the armrest. That didn't feel right. A few rows away, passengers murmured in confusion, the tension inside the cabin rising. Then the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing unexpected mechanical issues. We ask that all passengers remain in their seats while we assess the situation. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. Mechanical issues? Daniel's eyes flickered toward the window, scanning the darkened station platform. If something's wrong with the train, we'll be stuck even longer, Maggie finished grimly. Elizabeth's throat tightened. They were running out of time. Daniel turned back to her, his voice quieter now, more urgent. We need to start preparing for the worst-case scenario. Elizabeth inhaled sharply. What does that mean? If Jackson's condition worsens and we can't get to a hospital... Daniel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. We might have to administer another dose of the medication sooner than expected. Elizabeth's arms tightened around Jackson, protectively. You said it wasn't a long-term solution. It's not, Daniel admitted, but if it comes down to it, it could buy us enough time. Elizabeth's mind spun. Every decision felt impossible. Every second felt too fast and too slow at the same time. She looked down at her son, so small, so helpless in her arms. She had never felt this powerless before. Maggie reached for her hand, squeezing gently. We'll get through this, sweetheart. Elizabeth nodded, but she wasn't sure she believed it. Daniel reached for his bag again, checking the remaining supplies, mentally calculating their options. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, the weight of the unknown pressed down on all of them. Elizabeth closed her eyes for half a second, taking a slow breath. Then she looked at Daniel, her voice steady. Tell me what to do. Daniel held her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of the world alone. The air inside the train was suffocating. It wasn't the temperature, it was the pressure. The weight of time slipping through Elizabeth's fingers as Jackson's breathing grew more unsteady. The flickering cabin lights cast eerie shadows along the walls, the mechanical groan of the train making everything feel unstable, uncertain. Outside, the storm raged, drowning out the distant hum of the city they still weren't close enough to reach. Inside, Elizabeth felt like she was sinking. Jackson was getting worse. Daniel sat beside her, his back stiff, his hands resting on his knees, but his mind was somewhere else, working through calculations, medical protocols, possibilities. Elizabeth could see it in the way his fingers flexed slightly, in the way his jaw clenched every time Jackson let out a weak, wheezing breath. "We need to give him another dose," Daniel said finally, his voice even. "Now!" Elizabeth's breath caught. "But you said—" "I know," Daniel cut in gently, but firmly. "But his oxygen levels are dropping too fast." Her arms tightened around Jackson, panic clawing at her throat. "What if it's too much for him?" Daniel turned to her fully, his expression serious, steady. "Right now, the bigger risk is doing nothing." Elizabeth swallowed hard, her heart pounding. She had spent her entire life making hard choices no one else had to make. She had given up dreams, sacrificed sleep, held herself together even when she was breaking, because that's what being a mother meant. But this choice, this one felt impossible. She looked down at Jackson's tiny, fragile body curled against her chest. He was exhausted, his little fingers barely twitching now. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. She felt the shift deep in her bones. She was losing him. Her grip tightened. "Do it!" Daniel didn't hesitate. With calm, precise movements, he prepared the dose, his hands steady despite the storm outside, despite the tension suffocating the space between them. Elizabeth barely breathed as he administered the injection. Jackson let out a soft whimper, but he was too weak to fight it. And then they waited. Seconds stretched unbearably long. Elizabeth rocked Jackson gently, whispering to him, "I'm right here, baby. Mummy's here. You're okay." Maggie stood nearby, silent, watching. Jade was stiff in her seat, arms crossed, her face unreadable for once. Even she knew that this moment wasn't about her. Daniel kept his eyes on Jackson, his pulse visible at his temple, his entire body wound tight like a coil ready to snap. Then Jackson inhaled, a deeper, fuller breath. Not perfect, not strong, but better. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders loosening just slightly. "That's good," he murmured. "That's what we needed." Elizabeth let out a trembling breath, pressing a kiss to Jackson's forehead. Relief washed over her in a dizzying wave, but it wasn't enough to fully settle the terror still thrumming beneath her skin. Daniel turned to her, his voice low, meant only for her. "He's fighting!" Elizabeth nodded, gripping onto that truth like a lifeline. A sudden voice crackled over the intercom, jolting them all. "Attention, passengers! We apologize for the delay. Due to ongoing mechanical issues and severe weather, we will remain at Albany Station for an indefinite period. Emergency services are still unavailable at this time." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. Indefinite period. Emergency services unavailable. Daniel's expression darkened, his fingers pressing against his temple as he exhaled sharply. "This isn't going to work," he muttered. Elizabeth's pulse raced. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Daniel said, his voice tighter now, "we can't sit here and wait for help that isn't coming." Jade scoffed from across the aisle. "Oh, sure, let's all just run out into the storm and hope for the best." Daniel ignored her. He turned back to Elizabeth, his voice lower now, calmer but filled with something sharper. "I need you to listen to me." Elizabeth nodded, her breath uneven. "If this train doesn't move soon, we have to find another way to get him to a hospital." Her heart pounded. "But you heard them. Everything's shut down." Daniel exhaled through his nose, thinking fast. There has to be another way. A backup plan. Ben, the conductor, suddenly appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "I heard the announcement," he said, "and I have bad news." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. "Worse than what we already know?" Ben nodded. "The storm's worse than expected. Some of the roads leading out of here are already flooded." Elizabeth's grip on Jackson tightened. Maggie exhaled slowly. "So we're trapped." Ben hesitated. "Maybe not." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Ben glanced over his shoulder, then leaned in slightly. "There's an emergency vehicle route behind the station. Staff uses it to move supplies. It's elevated, so it might not be flooded yet." Elizabeth's breath caught. But, Ben sighed, it's not meant for passenger use. It's only accessible with clearance. Daniel's expression hardened. Then we get clearance. Ben let out a dry laugh. It's not that simple. Daniel didn't blink. It needs to be. Ben stared at him for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. You're serious about this? Daniel's gaze flickered to Jackson, then back to Ben. Yes. Ben's lips pressed together. All right, he said finally. Let me see what I can do. And then he was gone, disappearing down the train car. Elizabeth felt like she couldn't breathe. Everything was happening too fast, and not fast enough. Daniel turned back to her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw something new in his expression. Determination. Resolve. He wasn't just doing this because he was a doctor. He was doing this because he cared. And that realization, it terrified her. Because if she let herself believe that someone like Daniel Whitmore, someone capable, someone reliable, could be part of her world, then it meant she wasn't alone anymore. And that changed everything. The train sat still, swallowed by the storm. Rain streaked the windows in endless rivulets, the heavy downpour turning the outside world into a blur of shadow and light. Inside the cabin, the air felt thick, charged with something electric, something waiting to snap. Elizabeth barely heard the low hum of conversation from the other passengers. Her entire focus was on Jackson. His little chest rose and fell too quickly, his tiny fingers twitching every now and then, his body still too warm. The medication had bought them time, but how much? She looked at Daniel. He was tense, his jaw set, his hands pressed together in thought. He had the look of a man who didn't like waiting, who didn't accept helplessness. She swallowed. If Ben can't get clearance, what then? Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered toward the door, where the conductor had disappeared. We don't wait, he said finally. Elizabeth's stomach clenched. You're talking about leaving the train? Daniel turned to her, his expression unreadable. If we have to. Jade let out an incredulous scoff from her seat. Oh, perfect! Because running through a flood sounds like such a brilliant plan. Daniel ignored her. Elizabeth pressed Jackson closer. The idea of stepping out into the storm, of facing the unknown with her son already so fragile, terrified her. But what terrified her more was staying here. She let out a shaky breath. You'd go with us? Daniel's eyes softened, just slightly. Of course. Elizabeth didn't know why those words hit her so hard. Of course. Like there had never been a question. Before she could process that, the door at the end of the train car slid open. Ben returned, his jacket damp, his face grim. All right, he said, running a hand through his wet hair. I talked to the station manager. Elizabeth held her breath. Ben exhaled. They're sending a maintenance vehicle onto the emergency route. It's not a medical transport, but it's something. We can get you off this train. Relief flooded Elizabeth so fast, she thought she might collapse. Daniel sat up straighter. How soon? 15 minutes, Ben said. They'll meet us at the station's side access gate, but we have to move fast. The storm's getting worse. Elizabeth's heart pounded. This was happening. She turned to Daniel, expecting him to nod in approval, but his face remained unreadable. He was watching Jackson, calculating something in his mind. Then he looked at her. We have to keep him as warm as possible during the transfer. Cold air could trigger another respiratory reaction. Elizabeth nodded quickly, already tightening Jackson's blanket around him. What else? Daniel hesitated. You trust me? She met his gaze without thinking. Yes. Something passed between them, something that made her chest tighten. Then let's go, he said. Ben motioned for them to follow as he led them toward the exit of the train. The station's emergency lights flickered above them, the storm rattling the steel beams of the platform outside. Elizabeth held Jackson close as she stepped off the train, Daniel right beside her, his hand hovering near her back like he was ready to catch her if she stumbled. The rain hit instantly, cold, relentless. The wind howled, nearly drowning out the sound of the maintenance truck pulling up at the edge of the platform. Ben rushed ahead, speaking quickly to the driver. Elizabeth barely heard any of it. She was too focused on Jackson, on his breathing, on the way the cold air made his little body shiver. Daniel was already unzipping his jacket. Without hesitation, he draped it over Jackson, shielding him from the rain, his hands brushing against Elizabeth's as he adjusted it carefully. She sucked in a breath. Daniel didn't look at her, but he didn't move away either. The truck's back door swung open. Ben waved them forward. "Go! Hurry!" Elizabeth climbed in first, Daniel right behind her. The moment they were inside, the door slammed shut, muffling the roar of the storm. The driver, a middle-aged man in a rain-slicked uniform, turned in his seat. "You the emergency transport?" Daniel nodded. "Hospital. Now!" The driver didn't argue. The truck rumbled as it pulled away from the station, the tires splashing through deep puddles, the windshield wipers struggling against the downpour. Elizabeth pressed Jackson against her chest, rocking him gently, whispering reassurances. Daniel reached for his bag, checking his supplies one more time. Maggie, who had climbed in last, let out a breath. "Well," she said lightly, "this is certainly the most dramatic train ride I've ever been on." Elizabeth let out a weak laugh, though her throat felt tight. Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. "We're going to make it." Elizabeth turned to him. His eyes met hers, steady, certain, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she let herself believe him. The truck rattled as it sped down the slick, rain-drenched road, tires splashing through deep puddles. The heavy storm outside cast eerie shadows against the windshield, the wipers barely keeping up as water poured in relentless sheets. The dim yellow glow of streetlights flickered through the windows, illuminating the tense silence inside the vehicle. Elizabeth barely noticed any of it. She kept her arms locked around Jackson, feeling the unsteady rise and fall of his tiny chest, the warmth of his fever against her skin. His breathing, though slightly steadier since the last dose of medication, was still too fast, too shallow. They weren't at the hospital yet. They weren't safe yet. Her pulse thundered in her ears, her fingers trembling as she gently stroked Jackson's damp curls. "Hold on, baby," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Just a little longer." Daniel sat close, his gaze locked on Jackson, his expression unreadable. But Elizabeth saw the way his fingers twitched against his knee, the way his jaw remained tight, as if he was silently counting down the seconds. "How much longer?" he called toward the driver. 15 minutes if the roads stay clear," the man answered, gripping the wheel tighter. "But with this weather, could be longer." Elizabeth's stomach twisted. Jackson didn't have longer. She shifted, pressing her forehead against her son's, her lips barely brushing against his fevered skin. His little body felt heavier than before, exhaustion dragging him under. "Elizabeth," Daniel said quietly. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Not when panic was pressing against her ribcage, suffocating her. "Elizabeth," he said again, firmer this time. She finally turned. His blue eyes, steady and unwavering, locked onto hers. "You're doing everything right," he said softly. "You've gotten him this far." Her throat tightened. "What if it's not enough?" she whispered. Daniel didn't hesitate. "It will be." She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But fear had its claws in her, digging deep. The truck hit a deep pothole, jolting them hard. Elizabeth let out a soft gasp, her arms instinctively tightening around Jackson. Daniel's hand shot out, steadying her. The warmth of his palm against her arm sent a jolt of something through her, something unexpected, something grounding. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. Maggie, seated across from them, let out a slow breath. "You two make a good team." Elizabeth's chest ached at the words. Daniel glanced at her but didn't say anything. Neither did Elizabeth, because she didn't know how to explain the way that single sentence made her feel. She had never had a team before. She had never let herself want one. The hospital lights came into view in the distance, glowing bright against the storm. Almost there. Elizabeth closed her eyes for half a second, then exhaled. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that changed everything. The hospital doors burst open, the fluorescent lights inside casting a harsh contrast against the storm still raging outside. Elizabeth barely registered the wet chill clinging to her skin as she rushed in, cradling Jackson against her chest. The moment they stepped into the emergency room, everything became a blur of motion, nurses hurrying forward, a wheelchair being pushed toward her, voices overlapping in urgent commands. "He's struggling to breathe," Daniel said, his voice firm, controlled. 18 months old, fever, rapid respiration, possible respiratory infection. He's had 2 doses of a bronchodilator, but needs immediate evaluation. The nurse nodded sharply, her eyes flicking to Jackson. "We'll take him from here, sir." Elizabeth's grip on Jackson tightened. No, I need to stay with him." One of the nurses gently but firmly touched her arm. "You can come, but we need space to work. Stay close, Mum." Mum, that word, so small, so ordinary, hit Elizabeth like a stone to the chest. Because she was his mother. Because she was supposed to protect him. Because she had spent the past 24 hours teetering on the edge of losing him. Her legs felt unsteady as she followed the nurses down the hallway. Daniel was right beside her, keeping pace, his presence solid and unshakable. Jackson whimpered softly, barely moving as they laid him down on the hospital bed. Machines beeped. Monitors flickered to life. A doctor in blue scrubs stepped forward, immediately assessing the situation. "His oxygen levels?" the doctor asked. "Dipped earlier, but stabilized temporarily," Daniel answered. "We had no access to oxygen. This is the first facility he's been in since symptoms worsened." The doctor gave a sharp nod. "Get him on oxygen. Start a nebulizer treatment. Run a chest x-ray and full blood work. Let's move." Elizabeth hovered by the bed, her hands trembling as she reached for Jackson's tiny fingers. His skin was warm, his breath still uneven. The nurse gently pulled an oxygen mask over his little face, securing the straps. The sight of it made something deep in Elizabeth's chest crack wide open. She sucked in a shaky breath. "Is he—" Her voice wavered. "Will he be okay?" The doctor gave her a brief but reassuring look. "We're doing everything we can. The next few hours are critical, but you got him here in time." In time! Her knees almost gave out. Daniel was there in an instant. His hand brushed against her lower back, just enough to steady her, just enough to remind her she wasn't standing alone. She turned to him, her eyes searching his. "You stayed." It wasn't a question. Daniel held her gaze, something flickering in his expression, something quiet, something certain. "Of course." The weight of those words settled deep inside her. Before she could say anything else, the nurse motioned toward the door. "He'll be here in the ICU for monitoring. You can stay close, but we need a little space to work." Elizabeth hesitated, torn between wanting to stay by Jackson's side and knowing she couldn't do anything more for him in this exact moment. Daniel gently touched her arm. "Let them help him," he said softly. "Come sit for a minute." She exhaled shakily but nodded. Together they stepped out of the room. The waiting area was quiet except for the hum of vending machines and the occasional footsteps of passing nurses. Maggie sat in one of the chairs, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. The moment she saw Elizabeth, she stood. "How is he?" Elizabeth's throat tightened. "They're treating him now." Maggie stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Elizabeth in a warm, motherly embrace. "You did good, sweetheart," she murmured. Elizabeth let out a slow, shaky breath, pressing her forehead against Maggie's shoulder for half a second before pulling away. Jade, surprisingly, was still there too, sitting stiffly in one of the plastic chairs. She didn't say anything, but she met Elizabeth's gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the closest thing to an apology Elizabeth figured she would get. She sank down into the chair beside Daniel, exhaustion pressing down on her. For the first time since this nightmare started, there was nothing for her to do but wait. She let out a slow breath. "I was so scared. Daniel's voice was quiet. I know. Elizabeth turned her head slightly, looking at him. He had been there through all of it. The train, the storm, the impossible choices. She should have felt embarrassed about how much she had leaned on him, how much she had needed him, but she didn't. She was just grateful. She exhaled, resting her head against the back of the chair, eyes fluttering shut. I don't know how to thank you. Daniel was silent for a moment, then softly, You don't have to. She opened her eyes, turning toward him again. Why? Daniel hesitated, then sighed. Because I know what it's like to think you're about to lose someone. His voice was lower now, almost distant. Elizabeth watched him closely, sensing something unspoken, something deeper. But before she could ask, a nurse stepped into the waiting room. Elizabeth? She shot up from her seat. Yes? The nurse smiled. Your son is stable. He's responding well to treatment. Elizabeth's heart nearly gave out. She let out a breath that was half sob, half laughter. Daniel stood beside her, watching her closely. The nurse continued, You can go sit with him now. Elizabeth nodded quickly, but before she stepped away, she turned to Daniel one last time. Something in her eyes softened. You're coming too, right? Daniel hesitated, just for a second. Then quietly he said, Of course. And just like that, Elizabeth knew. She wasn't alone anymore. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the hospital room. Soft, steady, reassuring. Elizabeth sat beside Jackson's bed, her fingers gently brushing against his tiny hand. His skin was still warm, but his breathing was stronger now, no longer the shallow, desperate gasps that had haunted her for hours. She let out a slow breath, barely able to process the relief washing over her. He was okay. After everything, the train, the storm, the impossible choices, they had made it. Daniel stood a few feet away, watching quietly. His usual controlled expression was softer now, the exhaustion showing in the lines around his eyes. But there was something else there too, something deeper. Elizabeth looked up at him. You stayed. Daniel held her gaze. I told you I would. She swallowed, her throat tight. I don't know how to thank you. You already did, he said simply. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just waited, full of all the things that hadn't been said yet. Jackson stirred slightly, his little fingers curling in his sleep. Elizabeth smiled down at him, brushing a curl from his forehead. I was so scared, she admitted quietly. Daniel exhaled slowly. I know. She turned back to him. You were scared too. It wasn't a question. Daniel didn't look away. Yeah. Elizabeth let out a breath that felt like the first real one she had taken in hours. The door opened softly, and Maggie stepped inside, holding 2 cups of coffee. Thought you two could use this, she said with a small smile. Elizabeth took the cup gratefully. Thank you. Maggie sat down beside her, taking in the sight of Jackson, peacefully sleeping. You're one hell of a mother, she said, her voice full of quiet admiration. Elizabeth's chest ached at the words. She had spent so much of her life wondering if she was doing enough, if she was enough. But here, in this moment, she finally believed it. Maggie patted her hand, then glanced at Daniel. And you, she said, tilting her head slightly. You didn't have to stay, but you did. That means something. Daniel hesitated. Then in a rare moment of honesty, he said, I couldn't leave. Maggie gave him a knowing look, then stood. I'll give you 2 a minute. She slipped out of the room, leaving them alone again. Elizabeth turned back to Daniel. You're different than I thought you'd be, she said softly. Daniel's lips twitched slightly. Oh? I don't know, she admitted. At first I thought you were just closed off, distant. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I was. Elizabeth studied him, her voice gentle. Why? Daniel hesitated, then looked away for a moment before finally speaking. I lost my niece a few years ago. His voice was quiet, almost distant. She had a rare condition. We did everything we could, but it wasn't enough. Elizabeth's heart clenched. Daniel continued, his voice softer now. After that, I stopped getting involved. I told myself I'd done enough, that I couldn't do it again. He finally looked at her, his blue eyes filled with something raw. But then I met you and Jackson. Elizabeth swallowed hard. Daniel let out a breath. You changed that. The words settled deep in her chest. She didn't know what to say, but she knew how she felt. She had spent so long standing on her own, believing she had to be strong for everyone else. But Daniel had stood beside her when she needed someone the most. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone anymore. Jackson stirred again, his little eyes fluttering open. Elizabeth's breath caught. Hey, baby, she whispered, brushing his cheek. Jackson blinked sleepily, his tiny fingers reaching for her. She let out a quiet laugh, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Daniel watched, a small, barely there smile touching his lips. Jackson turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on Daniel. Elizabeth hesitated. Jackson, this is Daniel, she said softly. He helped us. Jackson blinked again, his little face curious. Then, to Elizabeth's surprise, he reached out toward Daniel. Daniel stilled. Elizabeth's breath caught. Daniel hesitated for only a second before carefully extending his hand, letting Jackson's tiny fingers wrap around his. Something shifted in the air, something unspoken, something real. Elizabeth felt tears sting her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't from fear. She looked at Daniel, and for the first time, she let herself imagine it. A future where she wasn't always standing alone. A future where someone stayed. Daniel's fingers curled gently around Jackson's tiny hand, and Elizabeth knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning.